Hi everyone, and thank you for coming this evening to Wakefield Foundation for our next In Conversation event. I'm really pleased to introduce artist Emii Alrai and curator and costume designer Sabrina Henry. So Emii Alrai received her MA in Art and Gallery and Museum Studies in 2018 and her BA Fine Art in 2016 from Leeds University. Recent solo exhibitions include A Core of Scar, the Hepworth Wakefield, Courtship of Giants, Eastside projects in Birmingham, Deposition Layer, Threshold projects in Leeds, and Passing of the Lilies, Jerwood solo presentations at Jerwood Arts in London. She has participated in residencies including In Ruins Residency, Calabria in Italy, Triangle Astérides Residency in Marseille in France, and was a Yorkshire Sculpture International Engagement Artist in 2019. She lives and works in Leeds, UK. Sabrina Henry is a textile maker and curator. Her textile practice researches rhythm, movement, and African diasporic traditions to create hand-knotted pieces that retell the history of Black diasporic presence. She works as a curator at the Centre for Contemporary Arts in Glasgow. So I'm going to go into the background and we'll leave the conversation between Emii and Sabrina, and then towards the end we can open it up and have questions from everybody. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. Hi everyone. Has everyone seen the exhibition? Amazing. Well, I wanted to begin by asking about the themes.
Yep.
Just in the text, you talk about forgery, mimicry, and rupture. And I just wanted to think about those in terms of the pieces themselves and kind of how those themes work within your research.
Yeah, I guess like my practice has like really been informed by archaeology, and I think like at the core I probably just wanted to be like an archaeologist, and then like I didn't become an archaeologist, and like somehow doing that through art making. But I think like reading quite a lot into the histories of like how archaeology kind of began like at the kind of the end of the like 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and like the whole process of like destroying stratas in the earth to like excavate these objects, and like thinking about fragments and how actually like these things that have been like dug up and unearthed through this quite violent procedure and then are like categorized and like put into boxes, and then they kind of travel through like depots, then they go to like museum storages, and then finally like the bits that like are like fit for purpose or like what are seen as like the most like whole objects kind of end up in museums where we kind of encounter these like histories that might like inform us about our own lives or identities. And I think for me like my first encounter with like a lot of like my kind of cultural background, which is like Iraq and like the Middle East, like through the museum. Like I remember going to the British Museum and being like seeing the lamassus, which are these like big winged bulls that are like kind of attached to they're literally like kind of like cemented into the walls like of the museum itself, and like seeing that and being like, oh my god, you guys like look like me, like you're the ancestors, like hi. And then also like do you know what I mean, and just but then also being like, it's like the theatre, like we're really led into this like specific space, and like the way that you travel through these like realms almost, where like, you know, these two lamassus are like placed how they might have been placed like in like the old temples, like, or like Babashtar, like, and how you like walk through this, and then like the way that museums like curate all these fragments and these like ruins essentially, like to kind of evoke something that once was, but actually like we don't even know what that one thing was, because that's not, you know what I mean, like, that's like history, like it's just so ancient, and also like these things have been like taken from their spaces and then like reinstated in like an environment where they like basically are like dead, like it's like this kind of graveyard space where like these fragments kind of behave. In relation to like forgery and like mimicry, I guess I kind of am really have been interested by like theatre techniques and set building, and the idea of like, you know, when you go see like a play or a set, like from afar for like 1 second, when there's all these different elements that activate that space, it becomes really real. It becomes like this really like palpable like
I definitely
environment.
noticed that straight away in here.
Yeah.
It's like, this is an owl, but it isn't an owl.
Yeah.
But there's lots of this particular piece here.
Yeah.
But you definitely get that sense in flashes and moments.
Yeah, well, we were calling this the surfboard the entire time. We're like, like put the surfboard up. But yeah, I don't know, like this, like I'm really interested in that, like that moment where something like becomes real or becomes like active. But also when you like look at it with a close eye, like these things, like this is made out of polystyrene, and like there's bits that have been like knocked about through its like use in the past and its like previous iterations, and like how that like this idea of something that's actually like quite fake like still can kind of like relay this history or like position you in a place. So I'm quite interested in like that as like a device, but also like I guess like making these images or like these objects, like maybe like the vessels and like the kind of smaller pieces that are like active mimicries, I guess, of like objects that I've seen in collections. And I used to work in the museum sector as an assistant registrar, so I was like really occupied with like the stewardship of these objects that come into the museum, and like looking after them and like embalming them for like the generations to come. I almost felt like I was like existing as a little like thief or like a little interceptor, because I'd be like, oh, like okay, like I'm wrapping this and like this like is going to be sent to this place and like I need to look after this, but at the same time I was like, oh my god, babes, like these objects, like I want to save you, like I want you to like not be here, like this is crazy when you see the amount of stuff that like these museums hold as well. But yeah, kind of I guess like my research process involves so much like looking and collecting and touching things through collections mostly, or like books, and then kind of these like amalgamations that are the forms and the vessels that like have spanned like through loads of different like historical times, but then they kind of behave in a way that like they're almost like the one thing. They're like this like one item that could be from like a specific place, but they're just like forgeries of things again and again and again. So yeah, I don't know whether that answered your question.
It does. I was thinking like about when you saw, and remind me the winged bulls.
The lamassu.
The lamassu. So I was thinking about rapture and with the way you've created this space here and how people navigate that. And where does that rapture come in? Kind of, as I'm thinking about it at the British Museum, they're probably recreating that space and trying to recreate that moment. But here you're recreating a moment that isn't real, or maybe hasn't yet come to pass, or could be or couldn't be. And I was just thinking about the rupture in that.
I guess maybe also like in the materiality of like the show itself as well, and like these objects that like are like in ways like unfinished or not perfect, or they're like chaotically made. Like you can see like all the cardboard that's like still raw, or like things that have rips in them, and like these like, because I guess actually maybe when we think about museums, it's like the object itself has also like experienced this rupture, and it's like stuck in this like other space that like tells it that it's like actually like where it belongs again. But it's like there has been this like total like severing from that and its land, and like what happens when you sever something, like lacerates, like you're always going to be like left with like some sort of wound and something that isn't like clean. And I think I'm really interested in like specifically within like the work, like chaos and like mess and like destruction and things that break and things that like also like they like are allowed to have ruptures that feel as violent as like maybe the ways in which objects have been taken. I'm interested in that, like the rupture of like the imagination too, like at what point does something like stop becoming like a world, and like you see it as what it is, and it's like these things are all like broken, or they're like really janky, or they're like they're not fully formed. But at the same time, like in this kind of imagined space, like these things kind of exist in their own like narratives. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. I mean, it wasn't really a question. It's just kind of thinking. I suppose we were speaking a lot when you were talking about these objects being taken from their place and kind of held in suspension in a museum, but they're also held and kind of petrified, to use a word of Dom's as well, Dominic White's, but they're kind of held in this space with that particular narrative. They're not really allowed to move and flow. They're not really allowed to take on further life, and we're not really allowed to imagine them as anything other than we're told they are.
Exactly.
And you mentioned the museum as death space before, which I really liked. But also maybe the museum as a kind of holding space. So there is still a potential, but there isn't kind of any way for it to move forward.
Totally.
And because you worked in museums as well, I wanted to talk to you a bit about the ethics, or ask you a bit about the ethics and logics of the museum. and kind of how that sits with you particularly.
Yeah.
You said you're a collector. You described yourself as a hoarder. And I was like, I know many, many hoarders.
Yeah.
I'm not a hoarder. I'm far too
I love that
OCD
for you.
That,
I love that for you. I hate it for me.
Yeah, I was like, oh my God, I love that for you. But yeah, I just wanted to ask you a bit about that because you collect also, but it's obviously a different logic and it's a different framework. Yeah. But I understood from that conversation that you still see the value in the collecting, in somehow the preservation of things, but obviously the ethics of the way that's preserved, how those stories are told is different.
Totally. Maybe the armature kind of like also like works within that kind of conversation as well, because I think like the way in which like we like approach and like engage within like the traditional museum structure that was like what is essentially the hangover of like curiosity cabinets that like happened, you know, like the kind of early 19th century, like all these kind of colonial like objects that like kind of came through and that were like stolen and like presented, and then, you know, people went back to these places and ravaged them for these objects, like the object itself like becoming this like political active thing. And like the way in which they're displayed, like the armature itself, like these like metal holders essentially, like how those, like for me when I was like going through like the V&A and also like the British Museum and seeing this and being like, actually like what is the difference between this and like a hunting gallery or like a trophy room, and like this relationship between like actually this like a device that like also like talks of the own violence of like holding something, like these objects become captive, they become colonized, they become like enslaved by these like frameworks, and like they are just like set in like a spot where they like are no longer able to like move from that, because like they're also like there's like a mean of conservation as well. But I was like talking to people who work within museums as well, and they're like actually sometimes these things that hold them captive, these armatures, like they actually start to degrade these objects because you can't get them out. So like these objects then like kind of become like attached to this like device, which like you know kind of like narrates what those are anyway.
No, I mean I kind of like the idea that the thing is still living and then it becomes part of the armature. So
also like within maybe like the context of this show, like it was really inspired by these like medieval hunting scenes book that I got by Gaston Phoebus, and the ways in which like violence has always been like used like as a way of like hunting things, like hunting game, hunting like animals to eat, but like the theatricalities around like violence as well I think is really interesting, and like how that's like really like remained within like a psyche, like when we go to museums, but also like specifically looking like the pre-Raphaelites, also like this kind of romanticization of like violence, like the kind of wounded soldier like over like the horse, like with like the arrows in his like chest, and it's like this really like beautiful moving image, and it's like kind of hot, and you're like, why is that? Like I don't understand, like what's going on, and it's just like it's but it's really like crazy, because then we like are so, you know, these like images of violence are so like normalized within like these spaces, also within like church spaces, also like I went to like a Catholic school when I was a kid, and like I remember like, you know, I was like the only brown kid like at this like church that was like opposite the school, and like yeah, literally be sitting there like I have no idea what's going on, like all right, cool, and then just being like, you know, I was just looking at like Jesus literally getting like his hands like put onto the cross, and it's like these images that like, yeah, I don't know, there's something
it's so normal as part of the way the culture works.
Yeah, and I think maybe like in some ways like it kind of ties into like this idea of like the ethics of objects as well, and like how those are like stored, like we forget that these come from like such violent histories also, like to excavate is to like disturb the soil, to disturb these things that maybe were resting, or like where like the detritus of like these like past civilizations that we are like obsessed with as like objects of collection, because we think they tell us about how life was or like how we live our lives. But what we do instead is like, maybe I'm just like generalizing, but like we don't ever see them as things that ever had use anymore. Like these things never just are able to be used again, and it's like they like have these really like finite lifelines in a sense. Like Ursula Le Guin like talks about how we were like these kind of natural collectors, and we want to like put things into like these like vessels, and like we want to carry these around with us, and that could be like a stone and a shell and things that like we're just drawn to. With that, like it's like the collection is like, is it the story about this object or is it the object itself? I don't know. And I think like I collect books, and then like I just love charity shops. Like I just literally live for the charity shops, and yeah, just like little bits of like little like things that are just like beautiful that you find that like have belonged to somebody else. Like they're like almost like museums in a way. Do you know what I mean? But like you have more ability to kind of like think about like what that object might have been, like who was using this, and also like be able to like re-enter it into a cycle of use. And I think that that's what I really like about like maybe the things that I collect is like no matter how old this is, like I can still use it because I own it. Whereas like in the museum context, despite you're not allowed to do that with it. And it's like, man, that would be a really nice mug though. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe we could use it, or like maybe we can like, you know what I mean? Yeah, I find it really interesting. Like also just in terms of like what do we collect and what have we collected when we think about like the museological object as well. Like a lot of the time, the kind of oral narratives that like surround those were never seen as important, and actually those are the things that like make those objects alive. Like it's not just about like, okay, this was like 20 centimeters by this and made out of like red clay with like inscription that was used by bamboo, blah 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 blah. It's like, okay, but like maybe the thing that's really important about this is its touch, is its way it's like being interpreted like within like the body as well.
When I was listening to a review on the White Pew, and she was talking about how people might think or feel about finding an old Asda mug with a dog on it. And it's exactly. Like,
totally that.
We actually don't know. I mean, obviously, the academic experts, they know more than I would know, but actually we don't really know what it was for. And when you're thinking about the touch and the sensory qualities, I know that you were explaining to me about sensory dues of objects and its archaeology in the senses.
Yes.
But thinking about these things, these artefacts, people's lives in a different way, and how if we're trying to draw a connection to them through the objects, how it can be more than just the narrative that is assigned to them.
Totally. And I think like what Yanis Hamelakis says in Archaeology in the Senses is that like that the object has always been political, and the senses, the sensorium has always been like very political, and that like objects just won't get their rest until they get sensorial dues. And he like uses this example of like this like Grecian like a bust, kind of like a head and a bust that was like in this like small village somewhere in Greece, and part of like the ritual of like the society that like, you know, it was like in that area was that it was like offered like shit, like excrement as like part of this ritual, and it was like to do with like fertility. And you know, somebody from like the Pitts Rivers Museum like goes and he's like, this is disgusting, like this is so terrible, we hate this, like this is just like so bad, and like removes this object that has like had such like a specific function within the society. And like this bust is like now like in the museum, and it's like so far away from like where it was originally and where it actually had this use. And I find that like really interesting, like when we think about specifically also like the Western Museum, and like it's just how like infected it is with like empire and like colonialism also, like they want to like keep all of these objects but like not give it like the sensory, like it's okay actually for things to be used, like we don't just have to guard them. But it's like it goes into like such a big debate about like objects and repatriation and stuff as well, and like how you kind of navigate that, and you know, like what is the function of the museum. I'm like chatting loads, like sorry.
Can I ask you about the function of the museum, or is that too much? Because you don't have to commit yourself to.
No, I mean I'm happy to chat about it.
Okay.
Like, because as much as I like shit on museums all the time, I actually love museums. Like, and I'm like the happiest when I'm in a museum, and I really love like objects, and I love like learning through them, and like seeing all these like mad things that like humans have made like throughout all these expanses of time. But I think that also like it's okay to think about them as like not just places of knowledge, but also places of theatre. And actually like they need people to make them active. Like the objects aren't it. I feel like I'm like they're just nothing without the people who made them, or like the people who like can like interpret them in like much different ways that aren't just like them
just statically being there.
Exactly. Or like they don't have to just be like academic and correct. Like there's so many different ways like something can be used depending on who you are, where you are, and that's what makes an object beautiful, I think. And also like it's okay for things to break also, I think, but maybe that's like contested, but that's where I break things in the studio.
Yeah, we were talking about that. Should we break more things?
Yeah, innit? But I also feel though like within like your work as well, like you were talking about specifically within like costume and like things becoming active and like these things like going on to like live with other people as well and like not holding that.
Yeah, I think I also make costumes and do textiles. With a lot of that making, it doesn't really make sense to me for it to just exist like hanging or something like that. Because I've mostly worked with live art and with performers and dancers. Actually, the fact of it needs to be ritualized, I suppose. Otherwise, it has a point. It's nice to look at, but you don't know what it does. And also because each body will activate it in a different way, and they'll bring a different sensory experience to it. They'll bring different rhythm to it. All these things, so that each time that piece is made live, it will never be the same again. And I think that's what I quite like about live work. Different to the theatre, I suppose, because you mostly work in spaces like this or outside, so you're not necessarily working within a huge set. So it requires so much imagination to think about what it is the performer is trying to convey to you, but also the music and the costume and everything else that is there. But yeah, like things being active, dynamic, in movement all the time, so that they can't stay, or you can't like keep them anchored and rooted, because who really wants to be? I mean, stability is lovely, but you know, who really wants to like stay stuck all the time?
Yeah, for sure.
But also then it makes me think about the arrows as well in your work. And I know I was saying to you earlier, like it feels like the point just before you might find them in an archaeological dig as well. And having those pieces in there and thinking about these objects, the surfboard and the horse.
Yes.
But also, I think you've spoken before, they're not a surfboard, they're not necessarily a horse, it's just kind of how they are labelled at the moment.
Sure.
And I think these pieces, were they initially sketches for some of the works too?
Kind of, yeah. So I feel like the way that like my process is, it's like so like research heavy and like just reading like a lot. So like, I mean, for like this body of work was like, I was looking a lot about like giants and mazes and labyrinths and like also like world building. I was like, Lord of the Rings, you know, love you, Tolkien, even though you're problematic, but I love you. And I feel like this idea of like world building and like making something that is like penetrable almost, like you can't like penetrate it, like I don't know, like I'm quite interested in that, like how these realms like within all these kind of like different mythologies are like built. And so I was doing that, and then from there like I have like a drawing session where like I kind of do the drawings. So these are like the 3 that remain of like the series that I made, because the show initially was at Eastside Projects in a different iteration called the Courtship of Giants, and they were just like ways of thinking about like I was thinking so much about like giants in mythology and like how they've always been something that's been hunted or been feared, and like they're always like, you know, like the end of the quest is to like kill the giant. We think about like Jack and the Beanstalk, like also like Gulliver, like getting like tied down by all the Lilliputians and like being like this like object of fear, something that you can't conquer. And also like the labyrinth, like the Minotaur that like is in the middle. It's like you go into a maze like in order to seek something or to like defeat something, whether it's just the purpose of getting out. And I was like quite interested in this like these like cyclical kind of things. So the drawings.
I thought about that before.
Yeah, so it's like mazes are so interesting. But and also like the fact that you enter it willingly as well, I think, to like
and then get angry with it.
Exactly. It's like you're like, this is so. Look, humans are mad, actually. Like they're literally wild. Yeah. So I feel the drawings kind of were like thinking about these giants and their various forms of like attack and the various forms of like wound as well. I was like really interested in like the idea of like, like wound, like these things that like haven't healed properly, these things that are punctured. And then I was looking quite a lot about like the romanticism of like violence. I also used to work at the Royal Armouries, which has deeply affected me, I think. And, you know, like seeing all of these like weapons that have been like made for the purpose of defeat or death, and like how we think about also history as like a progression. Like Ursula Le Guin talks about this as well in the Carry Bag Theory of Fiction, where she talks about how like mankind thinks about the way in which we have progressed as a society is like how many battles we've like conquered, and like the objects that like also kind of validate that experience like also being collected, and that, you know, the stories that are like retained are the ones of like, I think she quotes like this, it's like the spears and like the long sharp pointy things, and it's like actually like the other things that are contained are like the vessels and like the other stories that happen. Going back to weapons and arrows, I was just really interested in how like arrows also have such a poetic lexicon around them. Like a crossbow like bolt is called a quarrel, which I was like, that's so poetic, like a quarrel, like a lover's tiff. And then like the bag in which your arrows are kept in is called a quiver, which is also like quite a sexualized term as well. It's like very like poetic. It's like, so I was really interested in how these things that are just like incredibly violent like also have this like double side to them, which is like this poetry that is like read into them. I'd been playing a lot with like armatures before as a way of like displaying objects, but also like them also being.
And the armature is like what the objects will stand on, so kind of what it'll be pierced with.
Exactly, right. Like these ones, and like I was just thinking about like initially I was thinking about those being like the weapons, but then I was like, actually like maybe it'd be cool to like do a bit of like piercing of like arrows like into these objects, like these things that are like huge that suddenly become very pathetic once they've become like pierced, or like how do they kind of function. But also like thinking about like how do you counteract like these histories of violence without also like using violence as a way to like almost reclaim them. So that's kind of, I was thinking a lot about that.
I noticed the wound in the second object in, but like the wound that's left from the arrow in particular.
Yeah.
Like, what isn't there? I mean, obviously there are arrows in all the pieces, so it isn't just like a gap in the narrative so much.
Yeah.
I actually found that the most interesting, and how that had been detailed.
Yeah.
Because even with the references, obviously, the images that you're using there, medieval, with the walls in particular, but that feels really fresh.
Yeah.
So it's really funny thinking about time in that way and how you've put all these things together.
Yeah.
And actually there's no specific time.
No.
And I suppose that is the theatricality of it, but you're also like existing in many times as a viewer.
Yeah, I think so. And I think because like all the objects also like, they just, like the way that I've worked since I started making work was objects have always just been reused and reused and reused again. So there's like things that are in the show that are from like the first ever show that I did in like 2018, and like they've all kind of gone through all these like different cycles. Most of the stuff from here is actually like the work is like from Eastside projects, but like they all had like different like configurations of the arrows. So like it's like this kind of movement also of like the objects like as they kind of like go on, like in like their kind of next showings, like things get chopped in half. Like one of the sculptures in there was like much bigger, and like we cut it, like, and that's what it became. Like so that these things like still continue to like live even though they've become like altered and disfigured. And I'm also quite interested in that being like quite visible, like these like bits of polystyrene that you can see, and it's like I don't want to cover this because like it's
going to ask you about that.
I don't know. I just think it's like I'm really interested in that, like that moment of just being like, actually, this is like not what it is. Like it's made out of polystyrene.
It changes, and
exactly.
You kind of allow it to change each time.
And as it appropriates itself, like again and again, like they kind of build their own history in a sense of like their past iterations, their past like narratives, and like they kind of almost become charged with that, I feel. But I'm still like learning that, I think, and it'll be interesting to see like with some other objects also, because it's also like interesting like when objects like they don't belong to me anymore. Like if they're like they get sold or like they become owned by somebody else, it's like, does the narrative just then stop? Like what happens there? Like I don't know. How
is that in particular? Because you're making something that you're hoping will live, but obviously not in the definition of living, or decompose maybe is a better way to describe it.
Yeah.
But how does that sit?
I think that like I'm interested in it. Like I feel like I'm also like interested in like what happens to these objects, like when they're like stored in a specific way or they're displayed like in like another context where they're not just like kind of in these like big installations and these like big like worlds that like are being built around them. Do they become like just these like charged objects that just sit and like contain all of that, or like can they be reused and reused and reused again? I'm just really interested in that relationship and how like certain things like will just displays will change. Like I feel like there's never really been anything that's been showed the exact same way before, and I'm kind of interested in that like as like a wider practice as well. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's always just quite fun, like being like, okay, how do these change? Like they don't have to become static. And I think it's interesting when we think about like how history has also been like given to us as something that is like the static thing that has like these facts and is like really scientific when it just isn't. And yeah, I don't know, like I always think about this quote by Laurent Olivier from his book, The Dark Abyss of Time, where he says, in order for an object to retain its identity, I have to transform it, deform it, and in the end destroy it. And I think that's really like beautiful to think about, like actually like for something to continue, like it's okay for it to have an end. I was like classic me being like, death. Death is the only option.
Sorry. A kind of death.
A kind of death.
Cyclical death.
A cyclical death.
Yeah. Well, I was mentioning to you earlier about flashing the Metropolitan, which it's a really short film. Yeah. And actually, I wasn't able to get a copy to show you before, but as it was described, it's really just going through the museum at night, and all the objects, artifacts, ritual objects are illuminated by a kind of camera flash. So you're kind of walking through and you see that, and kind of what you think about there. It's written, a piece about it was written by Moira Jeffrey, and she talks about the reanimation of ghosts, and that's kind of how it felt, different to how you might understand the museum in the daytime, you know, as a tourist, or however it is in that moment, like you just get kind of bursts of what that activity or life might have been. I know you kind of responded thinking about In the Wake as well, and I did want to ask you a bit more about that. I read that book a little while ago, but for kind of different reasons. So obviously when you're coming to it at different points in research, like, oh, what does it speak to other people about? But kind of thinking about the wake work and the reanimation of ghosts, which you might be wanting to articulate in your work, or even just thinking about as you're making, rather than really specifically trying to put spirit or something like that into your work.
I think I'm just really interested in like, I guess like this idea of like the reanimation of ghosts, but like that being present also like within bodies also, and like how scientifically, like, you know, like our grandmothers like carry like 3 generations of eggs like within their stomach.
When I read that, I couldn't believe it.
I know, I was like, this is insane.
That's like the crazy,
It's nuts, but I'm like, okay, it makes sense. Like, like that's so really interesting. So there's like 3 generations in like one body, but if we think about that going forward, like how do we think about that going back? And like also like how the body also like is and has been responsive to like all sorts of like ruptures and traumas, and like migration also. I think like I'm really interested like within that, maybe just because of like my situation of like the war in Iraq, like the multiple wars actually, and like that like severing of like a geography, and then like a restarting of a geography like in this country, and like that kind of like thinking about like actually like how the body is still like actively processing, and like how these like things like are passed down, and like the baby in the belly like will always be like consuming these like past like, or like the present even, like, and it like I don't know, it's like always like churning. I feel like it's really interesting,
it's
and
kind of re-articulated through past stories you weren't necessarily part of, but you kind of potentially living on repeat through different situations.
Totally. And I think when I read In the Wake, like I still haven't like properly finished it, but I was just really like interested in like I think she talks about Christina Sharp talks about, I think it's called like ocean time. I can't remember, where she talks about how long it takes for like a drop of blood to like circulate out of the sea. And I was like shaken when it was like something like 260 million years it takes for like one drop of blood to process out the sea, and like thinking about the weight of which like these other things or these landscapes also like carry, like how long does it take like for memory not to be like sedimentary. Like it's really interesting. I'm really interested in that, like in relation to like archaeology also, like how like long does it take for an object to die. And like this is what I was saying when we chatted initially, being like, you know, there's like things in like museums that are just dead, like they're just so dead.
I was quite shocked to hear you say that. I was like, no, everything lives, right? No, it's dead.
It's just dead. It's dead. It's so dead. I was like, these are dead. Like they have no, they don't have anything.
They've been so severed from
their
point of origin, from whatever connection they might have had.
Yeah, I think so. But it's still something that I'm also like just trying to like figure out, and like I think in this kind of next body of research that I'm about to like plunge into, like I like really want to like think about that a bit more, and like time as well. And
can I ask you a bit about that? When I was on the train, I just was like thinking about time, value and money, and then it turns out that's an economic thing that I didn't want to stray into in that way. However, like those three things, when I'm, I guess, thinking about making or work or anything like that, I'm usually thinking about what the value of it is, how long it takes, and how much it costs, like in a really practical way, and actually which value is more important to me at any given time. And I suppose in that way, just thinking about your next piece of work as well, if you're able to talk a bit about that and some of that research that you're doing, and actually straying into time, and I'm thinking about the value of time as well, not just yours, but the value of the time something is there, kind of taking it out of that, using the research of a period of time and trying to put it into a current context too. I guess trying to switch the balance from like a capitalist mode of time, but like the value of like what could be deep time or long time, or
of course
expanded
slow time. I'm living for slow time. Like, please let me live in slow time.
They won't let us.
They won't let us. But I think like something that I've been learning over the past year in terms of like how I'm really like responsive to like ways of working, and like specifically within the research period, just because I'm like such a massive nerd, and like I just like want to sit with books and like go and visit places, but like actually trying to carve the time out to be like, no, like I just don't want to make like things that are like that can go onto a market, or like that I'm just not really that like interested in like just like that kind of complete total production. Actually, like I'm really interested in like collaborative work specifically. So like the way these exhibitions go up, like I have like amazing teams that help me to do this as well, like particularly with Courtship of Giants, like we wrote like a Arts Council bid, and you know that was like to like hire some people to help like with like doing something that was like so big, and like having the time also to do that. Like I moved to Birmingham for a month to build the show,
and the team around the work as well.
They were all mostly based in Birmingham. But like the next show that I'm kind of like about to plunge into is a show next year at the Grundy, and the show's going to be about celestial navigation, and it's really exciting. But part of the research of that, like I'm taking one-to-one lessons with an astronomer called Nick Lister, who's amazing, and there's things where like I can't, no matter how much I'll read about the stars, like I'm just not going to learn anything about them. And actually like I want to use like, you know, funding to also learn things from as well, and like actually taking the time to do that and to think about things. When I think about the last like couple of years, it's just been like, it just feels like you're just being churned all the time. But I feel it's like I'm very like fortunate to be able to do that. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm really like aware of like how lucky I am to even like get to do these projects, and to at the moment like be like, actually like I need the time just to do that. But at the same time, like things are always churning in the way as well, because I'm like, man, I need to pay my bills, like I like they're not going to pay themselves, like I need to pay my rent, like. So I'm just interested in like slowness also as like a practice. I think a little bit more. I'm trying to live less like frenetically and like feeling that things need to have a specific goal. And maybe that's also why I'm interested in like rupture and breakage as well. And actually like what happens when you don't make things that are like linear or like things that are like finished in a way. Like what is that conversation?
But also if you think about non-linear and you think about celestial navigation as well, then you're kind of opening yourself up quite widely to whatever that research can be and kind of where it takes you if you're going quite deeply into that.
I'm scared.
Yeah.
I'm scared. I'm like, space is frightening, but also amazing. But I just, it's really interesting, like, that the only fixed things in life are like the stars and death. And it's like, these are the things that like, I feel so like distant from. In many ways. So I'm like, I kind of want to learn more about them. I don't know, I guess like archaeologists also, and like the practice of archaeology is literally just spending time with like the buried. And it's like something that's become so like scientific as a practice that you like forget that actually like, that it is actually like this process of so similar to like funerary practices as well. And
lightly dusting. And,
exactly. And like putting into boxes and like swaddling and embalming and also like digging. And I think that there's something that's really like interesting within that. And thinking also about like the Western curriculum also and like the death of like so many other histories that like have just never been told to us because of the ways in which we have been educated as well. And I think that the kind of onus on knowledge being very linear also, and I think maybe also like how museums present like time is also very linear as well, when actually like these things are always constant around us and they come from like conversations. They are just more active and like actually like again I'm going to quote like Laurent Olivier where he talks about like the past never actually being like the present actually never being able to exist because like everything is so saturated with the past already. And it's like I find that so interesting, like what happens when you like reshift like these scales of time. What is made? I don't know. I feel like I've gone deep, sorry.
That's all right. Was anyone able to exist in there now? I haven't found that.
No. But yeah, archaeology is mad. Basically. It is wild. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I think it's a question I've been trying to work out. This idea of that death of an object. What qualifies that object as dead? The stuff about the kind of performance of significance or the performance of symbolism or value. Is it the end of the performance or is it the breakage? But then archaeology like reanimates those. I speak also as the daughter of a serious hoarder.
Yeah.
And like that's a very personal quest of like how the fuck do I work out what the value of this stuff is?
Sure.
But also in the kind of museum context.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think my question is, how do you know when it's dead?
I don't know. I mean, I guess like it's so interesting because I feel like, you know, like have you watched them like videos of like people like opening like Nike boxes or like Nike shoes and like they just haven't been worn for ages and like they just like disintegrate and they just like when you don't wear these shoes like they just like stop working because the function of it was like made or like that material is made for like you pounding on it and like that's what keeps them alive for like years and years and years. But when you don't use them they like literally just like crumble. The videos are mad. But I think, I don't know, I guess for me it's like the object dies when like it just no longer has a function, like it no longer like operates as something, it no longer has like a relationship to like any way in which it might have had a use or a purpose or like a space. But I also don't know, like I'm also like still trying to figure like, or trying to think about like, yeah, what does it mean for like an object to die and like, can you reanimate them? Like, again, Laurent Olivier, who I keep quoting all the time, he's great. We were having a conversation and he was talking about how there's this like temple, I think it is in Japan, that's like, it's renovated every single year, but it's like well old, like, do you know what I mean? It's like centuries old. And it's like really interesting, like how, because it's like looked after every year and like renovated and using like more modern materials, like it still like exists as a place of worship where people can go and like can use that space, unlike other like archaeological sites where like they like no longer like have a function. Like you don't go there to pray, you don't go there to like congregate. They like don't operate as places of ritual space. And I find that really interesting. Like even though that is like that like temple, for example, is like super alive, like there's also this like debate of like, actually is it like this dead thing because it didn't exist as like its archaeological like finding, and it's the remain of what it was because it's constantly churning. So I don't really know, but yeah, I think it's to do with usage.
It's really interesting then, if it's to do with like function and use, how does that translate to an art object? When you were talking, it reminded me of working for a film festival, people insisting on spending loads and loads of money on sending hard drives around the world.
Yeah.
Like, just do a file transfer.
Yeah.
It doesn't cost anyone anything, and the hard drives would come in the boxes that the big reels used to come in.
Yeah.
And it just was
That's
like,
so interesting.
It was the performance of value. We have to spend hundreds on posting it. So
Yeah.
the value of having it here. When we were talking about the kind of performance of value then in an art context.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting trying to work out how that relates then to if it's dead when it doesn't have a function.
I find it so interesting, like, and I think it's something that, I think about a lot, like also like within like repurposing works all the time. And I feel it's like why I really like repurposing stuff as well, because I'm like, not just because like I started doing that because I just didn't have any money for materials or like other like or places to store things, so it was like, well, we'll just use this and cut it up. And like also because polystyrene is like the worst material in the world, and like I hate it, but it's also like an amazing material because you can do so much with it. But it's like, like trying to reuse these things again and again and again until like I can, just to be like, okay, I'll like use this to its like end point. It's like a deathless material, which is really interesting also. But yeah, I'm sorry, polystyrene is like not cute. It's not cute.
But it is already there.
It is already there. So like I try to get like secondhand stuff most of the time, because it exists within the world.
And I was on a walk yesterday, the guy was speaking about hyper objects, which I think styrofoam and polystyrene would fall into.
Yeah.
So they kind of exist, reform and re-exist, like against kind of against the time we might be in, or in a longer period of time.
Yeah.
I suppose these objects would do exactly that because they're plastic.
Yeah.
Underneath.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. There's a different value.
Truly,
in
yeah.
that. Archaeologically even.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think it makes sense for you to use these materials because they're what you would package the objects with. So
True, actually, yeah. Yeah, that's true. I never thought about that.
That's what I think about when I look at it. They're the kind of materials that you see these objects packaged in. But do you struggle with the? Do you have like a tension between functional objects and non-functional works and objects? Do you? Because it seems like you almost make some maybe functional things, and then a lot of it isn't. And do you struggle with the tension of that? Do you think about sustainability a lot? And because obviously you reuse a lot of works.
Yeah, I think about like sustainability a lot in that, but also like to like self-sustain is like, because these installations like are huge, like, and I'm also like, I'm only one tiny baby person, like with a bad wrist, like, so I'm also just like, how do I like, oh my God, it's bad, eh? But like, actually these things already exist, like we can just reuse these in these contexts and like play with like the play almost, like, but yeah, I do think I do struggle with it sometimes, and I think like whenever I'm like about to do a show, like I'll always like make a pot, and that'll sort of like mark like the beginning of like that show, and like then some of these like objects like will kind of follow like the theme of like one of these pots, and it's like, I don't know, I make them so they're like kind of have like some kind of root in functionality, but then like I was saying like earlier, like I was in the studio yesterday and I was just like, right, this is like an old piece that needs to go out on display at the moment. I was like, bang, smash, like smash the leg off, like how do I change this like as something, and like also trying not to be so precious as well, I think, with things. And I think also like within like my own like personal life, like I have got lots of objects, but like I'm like not like a proper hoarder, I don't think, but like I feel like I'm also trying to be less precious about like material objects, and like I have loads of clothes. I used to work in like a vintage shop, and like I love clothes and charity shops and stuff like that, and I'm like, right, I can just give these to my friends also, do you know what I mean? And also like these things like then live on in another context from like not wearing it or like whatever, and I'm like, yeah, stuff like that. I'm just trying to like think about a bit more and retrain myself to be like, it's okay not to hold on to everything. Like specifically when I'm like reading so much about like object preservation and like the grip that like museums like have on these things, I'm like, I don't want to be the museum. I want these things to like go and be happy with someone else. Like I want them to be worn or like be used, you know. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool.
This is going a bit to the astronomy more. Do you think something that has a use but cannot be touched can be classed as an object?
Possibly.
The reason why I say this is like back time astronomers used to use the stars as a map instead. So would it be classed as like a universal object?
I love the idea of that. I don't know. I guess like, I guess my initial thought was to think about like just like stories and like oral histories. I'm like really like interested in like my family histories, and like conversation is something that's really like part of our like culture, is to like we like make stories a lot, specifically with like the women. And I feel like those stories are kind of almost like tangible objects in a sense, like because they like serve like a purpose of like filling like an unknown. And I think that that's really like beautiful, and the way that like story or language has been like used over so many different times and so many different scopes, like maybe it is an object. But it's funny because I think when I think of an object, I really think of something that's like physical. So I haven't really thought about it like outwardly, but yeah, maybe like I love the idea of like a universal object, of just being like, this is something that we can all just use. That's cute. Yeah, thanks. I feel like I'll think about that. I don't know if that answered the question. I don't know.
It's just open conversation, so it's
Yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think?
It kind of leads on to something that I was thinking about around that sort of that idea of having maybe something to do with archiving, and the kind of intangible parts that I think both of you were talking about, performance and how the museum as a space of theatre, and then costume as something that requires people to activate it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's obviously like a key part of the work, is having people, like it doesn't, you know, it's dead unless we're here looking at it.
Yeah.
So it's sort of thinking about, the question I guess is something around, how do you, or is it important to archive or document the bodies that work in interaction with the work?
Yeah.
And how does that sort of tension hold with what you were talking about, not wanting to hold on to objects, or trying to think of different ways of understanding museum collections potentially, or kind of the importance of capturing oral history, for instance, or things that are non-object based or that are more temporal?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily agree that something is dead unless there's someone to look at it.
Yeah.
But that was all I was like, no,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's true. I don't think, just in that sense, I don't think everything requires an audience, but it requires a maker or a facilitator.
Could there be something to do with the idea that an object is dead when it stops being useful? Maybe something like that is what I'm kind of sort of getting at, that there's like a kind of, there's something there about sort of capturing the relationships that happen, right? Between people and objects, and the clothes that we wear, or the things that we wear, like, and how that kind of creates that context so that we understand something. And so I suppose, how that then might kind of feed forward in the work, or like how you sort of think about recording the work even, I don't know.
Yeah, what was brought to mind is like a project that Michael Rakowitz did, called like the Geniza Project, and it was about like how in, I think it's like Jewish Iraqi culture, there's like a, when like holy like books or scriptures or like objects that have had like ritual use like cease to like function, or they like are like no longer in need of being used, they go to this thing called like a geniza, and it's like a temporary space of holding these things, and then before they're buried. And it's like this really like I found that like so interesting, is this like thing of like there is like this like third space that is created for like something's longevity, and like it's respect also like of these things to be like we're not using these anymore, but like they're not just something that we're just going to like chuck in the bin or like just like instantly bury, and like this kind of like relationship maybe to like how you would treat an object as to how you might treat a body as well. And I thought it's a really like beautiful work, and like he basically like plants like a palm tree like on top of these specific objects, and it's just a really like beautiful project. I don't know if this like answers the question at all, but I was like chatting earlier about how like I use like plaster a lot, and like I think plaster is a really interesting material because it's just like this like stone that has been like powdered, and then you like add water to it and it becomes this like reconstituted stone. But like what happens with that, specifically when you're using it with your hands, like it basically like takes the imprint of the body like with it, and like that existing like in a room where like loads of people have like used that same material, like all these gestures of other people have been like calcified like within this like material that's like remade itself. And I find that like really interesting, but I don't actually know if that like was at all to do with what you asked, which I'm very sorry about.
Like leads into something else that I was like just sort of thinking about in terms of your sort of like uses of materials in relation to that kind of slow deep time thing, where you're using a new material which is going to be around forever and has polluted our planet beyond anything.
Yeah.
An extremely old material that's millions of years old that has become something mass produced, but that actually, which is like clay, right? So that, but it's something that is everywhere, but nobody really, it's completely divorced from its history and its space, and it's like where it comes from. And then you're also using plaster, which is like obviously that kind of has that same kind of connection to the earth, but then also like cardboard, which is something really, really throwaway. Yeah. So there's all of these like different, I suppose like it's a kind of, that's an idea of stratering or kind of layering archaeologically in relation to materials. I think the work's doing that incredibly well, and like from a material point of view, there's really interesting kind of connections and crossovers with that.
Thanks. Glad that you think so. That's really nice to hear. I guess like with stuff like the cardboard, especially, like I think when I first started using it was in 2018, and it was like I just had no money. Like, and I was like, what can I get that's like available and like what is like cheap to do? And it was like cardboard like is just what is like available. And I was like working at like this arts like institution, and like they just like got loads of packages. Like they got so many packages, so I'd be like, can you just like save the cardboard? So like loads of the cardboards, like, you know, like also part of this like really like wasteful like do you know what I mean? Like loads of them are from like Uncle Jeff Bezos. And like it's just like, I don't know, there's all these like like the horrible uncle. But yeah, like I don't know, it's like trying to feel like, well, these things are just like, where are they going to? Like how can I like give them a function in a way? And then as they kind of go on and they get older, they disintegrate, and then what also happens there, like, is that interesting? Like, what is the mark that's left? I don't really know.
But it was such a really nice way to think about
definitely.
the materials as well. Like,
Thank you so much. Thank you.